Right. So this week, because the poems are modernist poems, instead of letting you guys um, wade through the fog, I'm just going to lecture. So we're looking at Marianne Moore. She begins the poem by talking to people who don't like reading poetry. And then she says, if you read poetry without caring about it, you may discover something genuine. That's interesting, right? Because usually when we read poetry, we try very hard to focus on things like what is the poem saying? Or how does the poem use language? Right? We care a lot about a poem. But here, Moore is saying that if you care too much, maybe it will become meaningless. Only if you don't care at all could you find something genuine and authentic. So we're beginning to see that she really is talking to people who don't like poetry. This poem called Poetry is starting to look like an anti-poem. So what are these genuine things? Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate. To dilate means to get bigger, like your pupils get bigger, 瞳孔放大. Hair that can rise if it must. She's talking about the hair on your arms, right? 起鸡皮疙瘩, goosebumps. Hair that can rise if it must. These things are important. Right. So hands, eyes, hair, these are physical things. These are physical body reactions. Uh, and so she's apparently putting these in contrast to when we read a poem. Usually in class, we're thinking about ideas, we're thinking about language. But here she's talking about reactions, physical reactions. These things are important, not because a high sounding interpretation can be put upon them, right? So here's the contrast. Here's the comparison. We're not talking about high sounding interpretations. We're talking about physical reactions. So not because a high sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. Interesting. Physical reactions are useful. I guess they can tell us something. They can give us a signal about uh, whether a poem is meaningful for you. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible. So when a poem becomes so derivative as to become unintelligible. Derivative means not original. So like you're just copying somebody else. You're doing what somebody else has already done. And here she's saying if you are unoriginal enough, it becomes harder and harder to understand. Unintelligible. This is also quite interesting, and this is the discussion question, right? Why might something be unintelligible? Simply because it's derivative. Usually we say like if something is unoriginal, then maybe you have already seen something like it before. So it should be easier to understand, right? But here she says it's harder to understand. And if we think about what she has been saying, interpretation is not the point. The point is your reactions. The point is to find something genuine. Then we start to see what she means. If you're only doing something unoriginal, that's not genuine. That's not authentic. It's harder to feel something when you have already seen it many times before. So when she says unintelligible, she doesn't mean it's harder to understand, it's harder to interpret. What she means is it's harder to feel, it's harder to find meaning from that kind of poetry. 意义. The same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. Yes, so therefore, if something derivative is unintelligible, and if it is unintelligible, then we don't admire it. then she's saying we do not admire what is derivative. We only admire what is original. We do not admire what we cannot understand. For example, right, the colon, for example, the bat holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat. So this is actually a philosophy joke because there's a famous philosophy paper by Thomas Nagel called What is it like to be a bat? And his conclusion is we don't know. It is impossible to understand the consciousness of another animal. So the poem's joke is uh, as an example of something we don't understand, the bat. And then now that we have animals, the poem keeps going with other animals. Elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree. You'll notice that these images, first of all, they are all of animals, and according to the philosophy joke, we don't understand animals. But secondly, these images are very vague. Even if they use concrete words, pushing, push is a concrete word, but we don't really have an image in our head. Why are elephants pushing? What are they pushing? Who are they pushing? What's going on? A wild horse taking a roll. To take a roll usually means when you fall down and instead of falling flat, you roll on the ground. But I don't think horses do that. So it's also a very vague image. What are we supposed to be seeing here? A tireless wolf under a tree. Okay, so we know wolves, we know trees, but somehow they don't go together. And then the immovable critic twitching his skin like a horse that feels a flea. Uh, immovable, of course, means you can't move it, but here it's also a pun, meaning you cannot move them emotionally. So like this critic doesn't feel. I think it's a poetry critic, but so let's say this poetry critic does not feel the poetry. They only think about it, they only criticize it. Or it says his, right? His skin. He only feels about it, he only criticizes. And this is, I'm sorry to say, another philosophy joke because Socrates called himself the gadfly of Athens. Like he's a horsefly flying around the citizens of Athens, annoying people with his philosophy questions. So by comparing the critic to a flea or to a horse that feels a flea and does not react, it's saying that even when philosophy, when Socrates, even when the truth is annoying this critic, he does not see the truth. He is immovable to the truth. The truth does not move him. And then continuing with our vague images, the baseball fan. Okay, so now we're moving into kinds of people who have little to do with poetry. Baseball fans, poetry, not a lot of overlap. The statistician, someone who is an expert in statistics, also not very related to poetry. So these are examples of what we cannot understand. A bat, vague animal imagery, someone who has opinions on poetry but doesn't really understand the truth, and then various other kinds of people that people who enjoy poetry don't understand. Baseball, sports fans, math people. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. Um, so we have a footnote here. So this is a philosophical allusion, not illusion, allusion. Microsoft does not understand what I'm saying. Allusion, Allusion. So the footnote says, quoting from Tolstoy, where the boundary between prose and poetry lies, I shall never be able to understand. The question is raised in manuals of style, yet the answer to it lies beyond me. Poetry is verse. Prose is not verse. Or else poetry is everything with the exception of business documents and school books. And this footnote was added by the poet, by Marianne Moore. So it's a poem that comes with its own footnotes. See, this is what I mean when I say modernist poetry is hard to understand. If the author actually wants you to understand, they have to add their own footnotes. So here Tolstoy is saying maybe poetry is just everything except business documents and school books. And Marianne Moore says we should not discriminate against business documents and school books. They are also important. So this is going back to the idea of do you like poetry? Should you like poetry? And here she's saying things that are not poetry are also important. One must make a distinction, however. When dragged into prominence by half poets, the result is not poetry. So here she's making a connection between poetry and the people who write poetry. She's saying you have to be a real poet in order to produce poetry. If you're not a real poet, then what you write is not poetry. So then the question becomes, what is a real poet? Nor till the poets among us can be literalists of the imagination. Here's another quote. This is from W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet who won a Nobel Prize. This is a critic talking about Yeats. The limitation of his view was from the very intensity of his vision. He was a too literal realist of imagination. Okay, so this critic is saying that if Yeats had a limitation, if there is something imperfect about his art, it was that his art was too intense. He was too literal, a realist of imagination. So whatever Yeats saw in his mind, he literally wrote it down in his poetry. And because of this, he hated every grace of style that might obscure their lineaments. So because, according to this critic, because Yeats was so literal about his imagination, he did not care enough about style, about language. He cared too much about the imagery. So what is Moore saying about this? Nor to the poets among us can be literalists of imagination, uh, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it? So she's saying that being a literalist of the imagination is essential for good poetry. So again, she's arguing against a critic, and she's saying like the really important thing is how you convey the imagery in your imagination. Style, language, that's less important. And so when you're so focused on the imagery of the imagination, you rise above insolence and triviality. Triviality means unimportant things. Insolence means being disrespectful. Here, what she means is you no longer care about whether you are being insolent. You no longer care about whether you are being disrespectful. And so the meaning of triviality also changes. You no longer care whether what you are saying is important or not. The only important thing is the imagery of the imagination. And so if you focus on the imagery of your imagination, you therefore can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them. I think this is T.S. Eliot. This quotation, another famous poet. So the idea is, even if your garden is imaginary, the contents, like the plants and animals, the toads in those gardens, have to feel real, right? Being a literalist of the imagination. Only then shall we have poetry. In the meantime, if you demand, on the one hand, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is, on the other hand, genuine, then you are interested in poetry. So before we all turn into literalists of the imagination, before we all become poets, we can begin by emphasizing the raw material of poetry and what is genuine. So for Moore, it seems like the raw material is precisely not interpretation. It is not copying a grand style or a tradition. It seems to be related to the genuine. Whatever pure imaginary image can get you to feel in your body the power of a poem. That is genuine. That, for Moore, is real poetry. And so to go back to our discussion question, why might something be unintelligible? Because it's derivative. Because when something is derivative, you might be able to understand it in your head, but you can't feel it in your body. You can't see it in your mind. And so it has no real relation to you. It is simply an idea on a piece of paper. Okay, thoughts or questions about number one? This is kind of interesting, right? Because like you expect, like when you talk about poetry that's hard to read, you may be thinking of the poems that we're going to talk about soon, right? The poems that look weird on the page or that use language in a weird way. Maybe you don't think about poems that are written like essays, but that's exactly what Marianne Moore has done. She wrote an essay in the form of a poem. And so, we think about poetry and essays differently, as I'm sure you are all experiencing on your midterm exam. And yet here Moore is forcing us to look at her essay as a poem, to use our literature brains to read her ideas. So if I wanted to come up with more discussion questions about this poem, I could ask you about the lines. Why does she break her lines in such weird ways? And the answer there is actually because she wants you to notice that how something looks on the page can affect how you understand the words. And so she has arranged her poem in a deliberately difficult to understand way. If you look at these lines, very, very few of these lines end at a natural pause in the language with like a comma or in the last line, a period. Most of these lines end right in the middle of whatever. And of course, that makes it harder to remember and harder to understand the language that's being used if the language keeps being cut up like this. At the beginning, I called this an anti-poem, and one reason is because she's trying to tell you only genuine and powerful imaginary images are the materials of true poetry. Now, does this poem use genuine imaginary imagery? No, it's an essay. So she's proving her point by writing a poem that does not do what she wants a poem to do and showing you how boring and hard to understand it is. By writing a poem that goes against her own rules, and by making it hard to understand and hard to remember, she's proving her point that real poetry is not like this. Real poetry has concrete imagery and it only cares about genuine feelings. Real poetry is the opposite of what she's doing in this poem. So if you read this and you feel confused and you don't understand what's going on, you are proving her point. This is not, according to her, good poetry. Isn't modernism fun? Okay, so let's look at question 2, the second poem. This is probably the shortest poem you will see in any literature class. This is Ezra Pound's most famous poem. In a station of the metro, metro here means Paris subway, although I guess we also call our subway system the metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. This poem actually has 3 lines. The first line is the title. So the title gives you the setting. Where are we? We're in a metro station. And then the second line is what the speaker sees. Faces in the crowd. And the speaker describes these faces as apparitions. An apparition is basically a ghost. So think of ghostly faces among a crowd of people. And then the third line, petals on a wet black bough. You think of uh, a tree branch after it has recently rained, and you can see flower petals on this tree. Pound is thinking of cherry blossoms, 樱花. This poem is supposed to be written like a Japanese haiku, 俳句. And Pound is playing the game of putting together 2 different images and making you see the connections between these 2 images. Can you see a similarity between ghostly faces in a metro crowd and cherry blossoms on a wet tree? And that, in fact, is question 2. Can you see that connection? So previously, I have asked students to discuss this question. Some said, yes, it makes sense. Others have said, no, it doesn't make sense. And so the answer seems to be, it depends. It depends on the reader's power of imagination. Depends on the reader's uh, creativity in mental imagery. Some people think of a crowd of ghostly faces, and if you blur the focus just enough, it kind of looks like cherry blossoms on a tree. And then other people think that this is just crap and no, there's no connection at all. But the mere fact that Pound wrote a very short poem to emphasize any possible connection forces you to think about, is there a connection? And in fact, you can even say that this is one of the fundamental operations of poetry. Why write a poem and not an essay? Because you don't want the reader to think about what you're saying. You want your reader to see and to feel what you're saying. So how can you combine images into a work of poetry that makes sense? And the answer is you have to depend on the reader. The reader has to do the work of putting together your images, putting together your, when I say images, it doesn't have to be visual. You can also have sensory images, 就是感官意象. And it's the reader who has to put them together. And I think that's the important point about this poem. It forces you to face the fact that you are the person doing the work. You are the person who helps to make this poem make sense or not make sense. Thoughts or questions about this one? So Ezra Pound is actually most famous for three poems. Yes, he is a famous poet. Yes, he is most famous for three poems only. Um, this is the first one. The other one is a very long, very traditional kind of historical poem, and he's famous for that simply because it's very long. The third one is very interesting. I used to teach this last year, but I decided to take it out for another more interesting poem by someone else. But the third poem that Ezra Pound is most interesting for is he wrote a translation of Li Bai Cangganxing, but he doesn't know Chinese. He worked with a Japanese literature scholar to translate this poem. Um, and I have to say, the translation is beautiful, but it's of course it's not very accurate, but it's beautiful in its own way. So, uh, if you want to, read that poem, you can go look that up. And then finally, like the most important thing to know about Ezra Pound is he was a fascist who fought for the Italians in World War II. Right. Okay. I guess another important thing to know, why is Ezra Pound so famous for only writing three poems? Because he was an incredibly good editor of other people's poems. So many famous poems from around this period of literary history passed across Ezra Pound's desk. And whatever advice he gave, whatever suggestions and edits he gave, inevitably made those poems better. Unfortunately, he was not a very good editor of his own poetry. Okay, that's enough about Pound. Uh, Next one is the poem America by Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein is uh, perhaps even more famous for writing unintelligible poetry. This one is actually one of her easier to understand poems. Um, Gertrude Stein also wrote novels, and her novels were written in the same style as her poetry. Perhaps it doesn't surprise you that she lived most of her life in France. Okay, so what is this poem saying? Once in English, they said America. Was it English to them? Once they said, Belgian, we like a fog. Do you for weather? Are we brave? Are we true? Have we the national color? Can we stand ditches? Can we mean well? Do we talk together? Have we Red Cross? A great many people speak of feet and socks. So that's kind of funny. Um, but let's see if we can make sense of this. So basically the entire poem is a joke, as you can tell from the last two lines. You have like very important words, right? Words about language, words about countries, brave and true, national. And then the last two lines are about feet and especially about socks. Socks are a very traditional joke. Think about Harry Potter, although I don't really want to think about J.K. Rowling, but think about Harry Potter. In volume one, they have the mirror of Erised, where if you look into the mirror, it will show you what you truly want in life. And when Harry asks Dumbledore, wait, well, what do you see when you look into the mirror? Dumbledore says, socks. I see somebody giving me a pair of socks. So it's a very traditional joke about unimportant things. Okay, now that we know the poem is supposed to be read humorously as a joke, that will help us guide, that will help to guide our interpretation. So once in English, they said America. That's a joke. Um, because, you know, if you're in Germany, you speak German. If you're in France, you speak French. But if you're in America, you speak English. Um, and it seems very natural until you really think about that. It is kind of weird. And so she points out this joke by saying, was it English to them? And you'll notice that this word English is not capitalized. Apparently, this is a contrast to the language. Apparently, she capitalizes languages And then if she's talking about like a basic adjective describing people in England or things from England, she uses a lowercase e. So she's saying, when Americans speak English, do they realize that they're actually speaking the language of England? Once, they said. So maybe they realized it before. Belgian. I don't know. That's just kind of funny. Um, I guess that's the comparison, right? If you're in Belgium, you speak Belgian. That's not true. Um, I guess that also adds to the joke. That's another uh, word that doesn't correspond to the language. Because if you're in Belgium, you actually speak French or German. Belgian is not a language. Okay, and then continuing. We like a fog. This is, I believe, English people. Or if they don't like a fog, they have so much of it that they might as well like it. Do you for weather? Uh, so you can take this sentence in two ways. As a question, basically, what kind of weather do you like? As a sentence, basically, do whatever you want in terms of weather. And so that's a joke with the previous sentence. If you say, we like a fog, the next sentence saying, fine, whatever. If you like fog, go like fog. Are we brave? Are we true? These two words are often found in patriotic American songs and poems. Uh, the national anthem ends with the two lines, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And then true has a similar meaning to that. And then the punchline in the next line, have we the national color? Color can mean color. It can also mean character. So the poem is at the same time asking, are we really brave and true? And it's also making a reference to the American flag. If you talk about national colors, usually you're thinking about the flag. So here she's also questioning the connection between these uh, personal characteristics and attributes and the idea of being from a country, belonging to a country, believing in a country. When you keep saying we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, are we really? Can you really tell that from our flag? Can we stand ditches? So this was in the period between World War I and World War II. So ditches is talking about war. Are you willing to fight for your country? Can we mean well? When you say that you're a country full of good people, can you really do good things? Can you really behave according to that image? This question is especially important now that the next president is once again going to be Donald Trump. Do we talk together? Coming right after an election, this is a very important question. Do we talk together? Do we talk to each other? Or do you only talk to people like yourself? Have we Red Cross? Red Cross is, of course, the medical charity, but the symbol of the Red Cross is supposed to mean mercy, 慈悲心. So this is asking the both questions at the same time. Can you commit to humanitarianism, and do you have mercy in your heart? All of these are big questions, right? Questions about nationality, about patriotism, about the national character, fighting for your country, being good people, talking across political divides, having mercy in your heart. But first of all, you'll notice that there are no question marks in this poem. So it seems like Gertrude Stein already knows the answer. She herself has an answer to these questions. And you can tell what her answer is by the way she ends her poem. After all of these big questions, a great many people speak of feet and socks. Instead of thinking about these big questions, instead of trying to be a good, brave, true, kind, merciful person and building a better nation, so many people instead focus on small, unimportant things. Your own feet and the socks that you wear. So today, when we talk about feet, for some strange reason, it has become connected with sexual desire. But traditionally, when you talk about feet, you're saying you're looking at your own feet. You're not looking further than your own feet. Another related idiom in English is you can't see beyond your own nose. You can't see farther than your own nose. In Chinese, we say 目光如豆. So her answer is to all of these questions, no. America is not that kind of country. It does not have that kind of people. So the question here, is it a positive poem? Fuck no. Okay, do you have other questions or thoughts about this one? Okay, moving on to one of my favorite poets, E. Cummings. I will say, first of all, when you see this guy's name, sometimes you will see it printed out all in lowercase letters, 全部小写. There is a myth that Cummings liked to use only lowercase letters. That is a lie. That was started by some editor somewhere, and it is not how he writes his name. He writes his name in the regular way, capital E, capital E, capital C. So I really love his poems because the form of the poem tells you the story of the poem. Look at this poem. L, parenthesis, and in the middle, I don't know if you can read this, a leaf falls. And then after, if you take out the parentheses, it says loneliness. So the poem is about loneliness, and the image that it uses is a single falling leaf. Okay, that image fits that theme, but why is the poem written like this? Which is, of course, the discussion question. It would have been the discussion question if I had written a discussion question for this poem. Why write it like this? And let me show you how brilliant this poem is. It is about loneliness, singularity, being alone, the idea of one. So what do you see here? One, 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 or here, this L is also one. So the idea of one is repeated here. Well, what about the middle? The middle part is about a single leaf falling. Can you see the leaf? First twisting to the right, then twisting to the left, then twisting to the right, then twisting to the left, before falling straight down and hitting the ground. It is a visual poem. If you look at the distribution between the shape of the letters, rounded letters and taller letters, you can actually see the leaf falling down. And then finally, I think the most brilliant aspect of this poem is, even though it is about loneliness, right? You see the image and it strikes you. It's a very powerful image of being alone and looking at this one leaf falling down. It's a very sad image. And yet, by using this first line, it becomes less sad. It becomes more whimsical, more like a passing fancy, just something that happens in life, nothing too serious. La, right? La la la, not too serious. Isn't that a great poem? Questions or thoughts about this poem? Cummings does this a lot. I could pick some longer poems, and there's a poem where the image of the words on the page actually shows you when something great happens. All of the church bells across town are ringing in celebration, and he's able to put that feeling onto the page. Okay, but the discussion question is about this poem. Anyone lived in a pretty how town. This is also, I loved it. I really love this guy. This is also a really great poem. So let's read through this. And, if you don't understand it, it's fine. I want you to listen to the music. Anyone lived in a pretty how town with up so floating many bells down. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. He sang his didn't, he danced his did. Women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone, not at all. They sowed their isn't, they reaped their same, sun, moon, stars, rain. Children guessed, but only a few, and down they forgot as up they grew. Autumn, winter, spring, summer, that no one loved him more by more. When by now in tree by leaf, she laughed his joy, she cried his grief. Bird by snow and stir by still, anyone's any was all to her. Someone's married their every ones, laughed their cryings and did their dance, sleep, wake, hope, and then they said their nevers, they slept their dream. Stars, rain, sun, moon, and only the snow can begin to explain how children are apt to forget to remember with up so floating many bells down. One day anyone died, I guess, and no one stooped to kiss his face. Busy folk buried them side by side, little by little and was by was. All by all and deep by deep, and more by more they dreamed their sleep. No one and anyone, earth by April, wish by spirit and if by yes. Women and men, both dong and ding, summer, autumn, winter, spring, reaped their sowing and went there came sun, moon, stars, rain. So even if you don't understand a single word of that poem, it just sounds great. But this poem does have a meaning. And in fact, once you realize its meaning, you will also be amazed. Um, so this is question 4. How does it tell a story? Who is its protagonist? And how important are they? We will get to these fascinating questions after the break. So while I have you, I just want to remind you that you can help me do my research by filling in this survey about using ChatGPT in my literature class, in this class. Even if you don't use ChatGPT in this class, please also go fill out the survey. Um, I do need more responses. Currently, I have 3 responses. That's not enough. So please help me out with this research. And then the makeup classes have been decided. They will be on November 15 and December 6, both of them Friday, both third and fourth periods, both at EE 511. And for both classes, we're going to watch a movie. And if you can't make them, that's fine. If you can make them, please come and keep me company. I'm very lonely. Okay, let's take a short break. Okay, so now that we have experienced the musicality of this poem, let's see what it's actually talking about. The key to understanding this poem is to realize that some of these words are names. Anyone is our main character. Uh, and then our other main character is, uh, where is she? Oh, no one. No one is another main character. So it's a poem that has a playful use of language. And if we keep that idea in mind, playful and flexible use of language, it will help us understand what's going on. So anyone lived in a pretty how town, which means, oh, it's kind of nice. Um, pretty how is actually, it's kind of like, oh, how pretty. So, it's a very nice town. With up so floating many bells down, uh, bells, if you think of church bells, they kind of swing back and forth, right? They go up and down and up and down. And so the beginning of the sentence, you have up, and then at the end of the sentence, you have down. Floating is talking about the sound of the bell. It floats across the air. So the idea is this place has many churches with many bells that ring from time to time. You can often hear the sound of church bells in the air. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. The four seasons in their correct order. This will come back. He sang his didn't, he danced his did, basically saying he lived his life. Right? In every life we do things, and sometimes we choose not to do things. So basically he lives his life, a regular life. And he lives it joyfully because he sang and he danced in his everyday life. So in the first stanza, we have a very cozy picture, like a pretty town, small, traditional, and our main character leads an ordinary life with an ordinary joy throughout the four seasons, across year after year. Women and men, both little and small. Okay, so women and men, right? Two kinds of people. And you expect big and small, but it says little and small. The idea is that none of these people are very big. None of them are very important. Uh, Women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone, not at all. So nobody really cares about our main character. And no, like none of these people are important people. The women and men are little and small, and none of them care about this person, anyone. So they're all unimportant people. No celebrities, no famous politicians, nothing. Just regular people. And that kind of answers, well, we'll get back to it. Um, they sowed their isn't, they reaped their same. This is also interesting. There's a phrase in English, you reap what you sow. 播什么种收什么歌. Uh, so if they sow their isn't, which is of course negative, if they don't start things, then they don't change things. They reap their same. If you don't try to change, no change will come. If you keep doing what you've always been doing, you will only repeat yourself. Sun, moon, stars, rain. So this connects with the theme of repetition. Daytime, nighttime, good weather, bad weather, same thing. Nothing new here. So if the first stanza gives us a quaint traditional town, the second stanza places us in a time, outside of history. It's a very like a folklorish fantasy kind of town, like a Christmas story, if you will. Children guessed, and then we have a long parenthesis, and the sentence ends that no one loved him more by more. So our story finally begins. No one starts falling in love with anyone. And the first people to guess are the children. Of course, children are always very perceptive. But the implication is that the adults are too busy. They're too busy sowing the same thing and reaping the same thing every year that they don't notice this small change, the beginning of love. And this idea is pointed out in the parentheses. Children guessed, but only a few, and down they forgot as up they grew. So as these children grew older, they became less and less perceptive. They started caring less and less about things like love. So this word down here is simply as a balance to the word up later. It by itself, um, there's no real meaning to that word down. It gives you an image of like it's a negative direction, so it connects with the word forgot. It feels like the same direction. But by itself, it doesn't really mean anything. And this line is, of course, also echoing this line, right? With up so floating many bells down. And here we have, and down they forgot as up they grew. Autumn, winter, spring, summer. Interesting. The four seasons, but now we begin with autumn. So the idea is that time is moving on. Right. Okay. Next stanza. When by now and tree by leaf, she laughed his joy, she cried his grief. So when is this love happening? Now. And you can see the tree of love growing a new leaf. She laughed his joy, she cried his grief. This should be easier to understand, right? Whenever he felt happy, she laughed with him. Whenever he felt sad, she cried with him. Bird by snow and stir by still, anyone's any was all to her. So the fourth line, slowly they fell in love with each other. They built a life together. All of anyone now also belongs to no one. Bird by snow. I like that image. Um, Snow, right? If something is covered in snow, it's like lifeless. It's predictable. But then a bird in the snow. I'm thinking of like a bird like popping up out of the snow, or like in the midst of this snow-covered scenery, you see a bird. Maybe even one of Wallace Stevens's blackbirds. Stir by still. Stir is the opposite of still. To stir means to move. Of course, the most common meaning of the word stir is like to what you do with your drink, right? 搅拌. But the original meaning is to move. In fact, this word is still used this way in modern English in phrases like he stirred from his sleep, which means he started moving and he woke up. So whether it's in movement or in stillness, whether it is in the snow or in the life of the snow, whatever anyone had now also belonged to no one. Someone's married their everyone's, laughed their cryings and did their dance. So the story that we just saw of the love between anyone and no one is now repeated for various other couples, people named someone, people named everyone. And so before we had laughed his joy, cried his grief, now we have combined them, laughed their cryings. This is to show that time has been condensed. Time is now moving faster, like a montage, 有点像蒙太奇. And did their dance. If you remember, dance is how anyone lives his life. So this idea is they also lived their lives together. And of course, dance is something you do with other people. So like the someones and their everyones are dancing through life together. Sleep, wake, hope, and then. So sleep, no matter if they're asleep, no matter if they're awake, They're always like living their lives together with hope in their hearts. And then I think these two words are here simply because of the meter, 格律需求, right? To make sure the music keeps going. They said their nevers, they slept their dream. Okay, sorry, I was wrong. And then is a transition. And then means however. So, they live together day after day, night after night, hearts full of hope. But then they say their nevers, they sleep their dream. The hope kind of remains a hope. It is never realized. They don't do anything to try to achieve their dreams. They simply sleep their dreams. Stars, rain, sun, moon. So this is an echo of the earlier line, right? Sun, moon, stars, rain. So again, the order has switched, time has moved on. And only the snow can begin to explain how children are apt to forget to remember, with up so floating many bells down. So this is like a comment on the earlier stanza here, as children start to forget things as they grow up. They forget that perceptiveness, they forget to care about love. So here the poem is saying nobody really knows why. And it's also echoing that first line, the second line, right? With up so floating many bells down. It's exactly the same line. Um, One reason why church bells might ring is on a holiday. Another reason is for a marriage. When somebody holds a wedding at a big church, after the ceremony has ended, the bells will start ringing. So here we have some related ideas, right? People married, living their lives together, children, marriage. It seems like we have an image of life, the generational cycle of life. Giving birth to children, children growing up into adults, getting married, having their own children, and so on. And in the middle of all of this generational cycle, the children grow up and forget about those pure ideas of love and change. So basically, life. One day anyone died, I guess. Huh. So this is important, right? Anyone, our main character, has died. And the poem says, I guess. Because if you remember, none of these people are important. So if you don't live in that town, if you're not part of anyone's family, if you're not a friend of his, who knows? Maybe he's dead. Maybe he died 2 years ago. We don't know. The newspaper probably didn't report it. He died, I guess. And no one stooped to kiss his face. Of course, to most people, his name is anyone. He's just anybody. But to his wife, he's very important. So we have this parentheses to emphasize, even though he's not very important, he is important to some people. Busy folk buried them side by side. So no one now has also died. And it's saying that the people who attend the funeral, who bury them, are busy. They don't really care that much about them. They're just neighbors. Little by little and was by was. The key word is was. Was is the past tense. So after they have died, little by little, they are being forgotten. They are being left in the past. All by all and deep by deep and more by more, they dream their sleep. So this is talking about no one and anyone now that they're dead. They're entirely buried in the ground. They are sleeping the eternal sleep. They are dreaming the eternal dream. No one and anyone, earth by April, wish by spirit, and if by yes. So now that they're buried in the earth, April is spring. Their bodies are giving birth to the next spring. They are feeding the plants that grow every spring. Wish by spirit and if by yes. Now, this is just my personal interpretation, but I think what this means is their love for each other, the hope that they had in life, their wish for life, their wishes in their lives, in their spirits, are now being expressed through the life force of spring. So the if is asking, after you die, do those hopes and dreams and loves go on? Are they continued in some way? Are, are they passed down in some way? And if you look at this spring, the answer is yes. Does that make sense? Yeah? Oh, you can think about that. And then the last stanza, women and men, both dong and ding. This is kind of funny. Ding and dong are, of course, the sound of bells. But here, by comparing them to men and women, it's saying that these people are also not important. Summer, autumn, winter, spring. We end with spring, right? Same with April. It's emphasizing the spring part. Um, so this is ending on a hopeful note. Reaped their sowing and went their came. Sun, moon, stars, rain. So it seems like life goes on. After anyone and no one die, they get buried. Their life force in turn is turned into spring, and the people in this small town keep on doing their same unimportant things. Uh, they go the way they came, so they keep going in the same direction throughout the many different days of their lives. So the question I asked for this one is, if it tells a story, yes, it does tell a story. Who is the protagonist? Anyone. How important are they, and why? So this is interesting, right? The poem tells us they are not important. But if they really are so unimportant, why are we reading about them? Why doesn't the poem just include them along with all of the other someones and everyone's? So it does seem like they are important. The poem makes them important. Even when they don't have a name, they could be anyone. They could be no one. We don't know them. They don't leave their names in the history books. And yet we follow the trajectory of their lives. We follow how they fall in love, how they spend their lives together, how they remain in love even unto death, and how their life continues to have an influence on the world even after they die. So on the one hand, yeah, they're not important people the way that we traditionally define that word. But on the other hand, they are important because they have existed in this world, because they have discovered love in their lives, because they have continued to contribute to the world in their own way after they die. So how important are they? They are equally as important as any other person in the world, which is, of course, not important at all, and yet very, very important. Questions or ideas about this one? Okay, so that's the 5 poems, and then we have question 5, which is asking about uh, Moore, Stein, and Cummings. I skipped Pound because we already talked about why Pound wrote his poem like that, right? About combining images. But what about, and I guess we also already talked about Moore, right? She's writing a poem that's hard to understand and hard to remember in order to help prove her point. Um, And we also talked about Cummings, right? He wrote a poem that looks like a leaf falling, and then he wrote a poem that emphasizes how unimportant his characters are. to contrast how important they actually are and how important everyone is. So in fact, the one uh, poem whose formal experimentation we have not yet discussed is Gertrude Stein's America. So why did she write the poem like this? Well, one way to think about this is think about how much time you need to read this poem and think about how much time I took to explain this poem. Writing a poem like this instead of like Marianne Moore's really long one is condensation. 比较精简. It takes fewer words and less space to express the same ideas. And that is one power of poetry, right? In a station of the metro is only 3 lines long, and yet it carries within itself a whole argument about how does poetry work? How do the readers contribute to the meaning of a poem? Same thing here. If the argument is about how America and Americans continue to fail to live up to its self-stated ideals, what Americans say they are is never the same as what they actually are, then this is a very condensed way of getting at all of the different aspects of that question. The language they speak, their identity, their relationship to the weather even, what they believe, what kind of people they believe themselves to be, how they behave in a crisis, how they behave in everyday life. And the answer to all of those questions is negative. And that is the negative answer is also very succinctly expressed in the grammar. None of these are question marks. The poet already has her answer. And the last 2 lines give us that answer without scolding the Americans, without saying, you guys are not really that great people. Instead, we just shift the focus to what they really care about. And it's obvious that what they care about is not really that important. So another reason why the poem is written like this is um, it uses the imagery, it uses the questions to very briefly get at the many different aspects of the question. Each pair of lines, or in the case of these 3 middle lines, the 3 lines are about a different aspect of the American culture, about the American personality, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, one last moment of experimentation is writing the word English in lowercase to separate the adjective from the language. And once you see this separation, you'll realize that writing Belgian with a B is a joke because Belgian is not a language. So it's kind of like saying, um, you know, Germany speaking German and France speaking French. You expect America to speak American, but then if you look at Belgium, haha, that kind of joke. Yeah, so formal experimentation is not, you can say not only or not mainly, depending on the poet, about making it hard to read. Some poets who are assholes really do want to make it hard to read. We did not read any of those poems. Well, I guess Marianne Moore counts, but that's part of her argument. Um, like T.S. Eliot has a poem called The Wasteland. Did we read this in English literature? No, because it's too hard. Uh, he basically said about that poem, I only want people who understand what I'm talking about to be able to understand my poem. So he did things like he wrote some lines in ancient Greek. He made allusions to Italian literature. He added footnotes that made things more confusing. He was writing for a very small audience, basically writing for himself. The poems we looked at today don't do that. there's a reason why these poems are harder to read, harder to understand. And it is because these are, according to these poets, the best way of expressing these ideas and of expressing these images. The formal experimentation is to help add to the main theme or the main idea of the poem. And this is another side of modernism. When you are forced to think about the language, when the literature is very difficult and you are forced to think about the language, then you are also forced to explore whether the language influences the content, the ideas. And usually if the influence is positive or like amplificatory, like it helps with the ideas and the themes and the message, usually we consider that a good poem. And so those are the poems that I chose for you guys to read this week. Okay, yeah, so questions about today's discussion slash lecture? Great. I hope you guys um, are willing to go back and read some of these poems after listening to me explain them, because they really have a lot for you to experience. Next week, we're going to read a short story by a modernist writer named William Faulkner. Faulkner. Have you guys heard of this person? So he is a very famous novelist, short story writer from the middle of the 20th century. And we're going to read a short story called Barn Burning. Let me talk about Faulkner, because this guy is very important. He won a Nobel Prize. So, by definition, he's important. He is the most famous and important writer to come from the American South. He lived in Mississippi, and all his life he refused to leave his small town. Um, in fact, because he became such a famous author, the university closest to his home also became a famous university because they had easy access to this famous writer. They had lots of researchers about him, lots of materials about him. Even today, the University of Mississippi at Jackson is most famous in literature for expertise on William Faulkner. So like that's how important he is, right? An author who bends a whole university to his will, kind of. So William Faulkner comes from the American South. In the U.S., the American South has a bad reputation. I'm sure some of you have heard this. It's full of uncultured rural people who don't know anything about anything and constantly choose the wrong choice politically. It's from the land of slavery. It's from the land of economic exploitation. If you look at all of the economic indicators for each American state, the worst state for healthcare, the worst state for education, the worst state for agriculture, the worst state for like infrastructure, all of these things. Most of these states are in the American South. And of course, part of that is because they lost the Civil War and they had to spend more time and resources recovering from that. And also because after the end of slavery, they had to reorganize their entire economic system. But part of that is also because when you outlaw slavery, or when they outlawed slavery, they did not outlaw racism. And so the attitudes of slavery continued into the post-slavery era all the way, you can say up to 1965, you can say all the way up to today. And a country cannot prosper when it is discriminating against half of its citizens. So that's some of the reasons why the American South has such a bad reputation. William Faulkner is a white guy, and he writes about his home culture. He writes about the American South. So you can imagine the literature that he writes is often focused on uh, people who are not, let us say, normal. People who have strange attitudes about their fellow citizens, especially black citizens. People who also have strange attitudes about the Civil War and about the importance of having like a pure bloodline or maintaining some kind of social hierarchy. Uh, People who don't seem very invested in the idea of America as the land of the free and home of the brave. Faulkner at first became famous for writing like very bloody crime thrillers about rape and incest and murder. But as he got more famous, he had more room, more economic room to write about what he really cared about. And what he really cared about is how growing up in that kind of culture influences a person. Even when you know that what's going on around you is not normal, it still has an effect on you, and it's usually not a good effect. And that's what barn burning is about. The story of barn burning is the story of a young boy who has to face the fact that his dad is kind of crazy. And by kind of crazy, I mean that when his dad feels offended or insulted in any way, his first response is to ignore the person and disregard whatever the person is saying, even if the person is his boss. And if the person keeps doing what his father thinks is offensive and insulting, then his dad immediately escalates into burning down the guy's house or burning down his barn. And then, of course, when they inevitably catch his father, the local judge, here called the justice of the peace, kicks him out. And so their lifestyle is an itinerant lifestyle. They move from place to place. And the young boy really does not have a stable, growing environment. And this is the story of how the young boy realizes that this is his life and he has to make a choice about what to do about this kind of life. Now, that's the story, but when you read it, you will immediately remember that Faulkner is a modernist. Modernist poetry has weird language and weird forms and stuff like that. Modernist fiction has long and complicated sentences. In this case, the sentences are not that complicated, they're just long. And so sometimes when you expect a period, you don't get a period. In fact, let's take a look at this first paragraph. This is a good example. This is page 5. The store in which the justice of the peace's court was sitting smelled of cheese. So, like, these places are so rural, so deep in the country, they don't even have a judge. They don't even have a courthouse. So instead, a local authority, like a landowner or a big businessman, will sometimes act as a local judge. And so that person is called a justice of the peace. They don't have a courthouse, so they pick any bigger building. And in this case, the building is a store. Okay, so that's the first sentence. That's not too bad, right? Very clear sentence. Then we get the next sentence, and please tell me where the sentence stops because I can't find it. The boy, crouched on his nail keg at the back of the crowded room, knew he smelled cheese and more. From where he sat, he could see the ranked shelves close packed with the solid, squat, dynamic shapes of tin cans, whose labels his stomach read not from the lettering, which meant nothing to his mind, but from the scarlet devils and the silver curve of fish. This, the cheese which he knew he smelled, and the hermetic meat which his intestines believed he smelled, coming in intermittent gusts, momentary and brief, between the other constant one, the smell and sense, just a little of fear, because mostly of despair and grief, the old fierce pool of blood. Period. So that's the second sentence. Uh, so as you can see, long, but it's not complicated. The logic of this sentence is, what does the boy smell and how does he feel about it? So he's sitting at the back of the room. He smelled cheese and more. He could see shelves packed with lots of different stuff, tin cans, right? Whose labels his stomach read, not from the lettering, which meant nothing to his mind. So he cannot read. He's too young, or maybe nobody taught him. He cannot read. So the lettering means nothing, but from the images on the cans. So scarlet devils, scarlet means red, or the silver curve of fish. So he recognizes the labels, he knows what kind of food is inside, and so his stomach reacts to seeing this food. He's hungry. So these things, this means these things, the cheese, which he smelled, the hermetic meat. Hermetic means sealed. 叫什么封口的. So I guess this means the tin cans of meat, 罐头装的, which his intestines, 小肠 or 内肠, believed he smelled. So the idea is he could smell cheese, and then when he sees these different tin cans of food, his stomach is telling him that he smells the food, even if he can't smell it because it's hermetic, it's sealed. Physically impossible to smell, but he's so hungry that he imagines the smell. Coming in intermittent gusts, momentary and brief, between the other constant one. One means smell. So he's smelling all of this in addition to the smell and sense, just a little, of fear. Why is he afraid? Because of despair and grief. Despair means lack of hope. Grief means sadness. Why is he feeling these things? The old fierce pull of blood. Blood here means family. So something related to his family, it's in this kind of courthouse place, makes him afraid and lose hope and feel sad. Next sentence, sentence number 3. He could not see the table where the justice sat, and before which his father and his father's enemy, parenthesis, stood. Okay, so his dad is in this courthouse, and I guess he's a party against another person, right? Two people have a disagreement, and they show up before the justice of the peace. So it's his father and his father's enemy. And then in the middle, there is this parenthesis. Our enemy, he thought. So you see this, these italics, 这个斜体, this represents thought. This is what he's thinking. These are the words in his mind. Our enemy, he thought in that despair. Ourn. Hang on. That's not a word, right? Ourn. Mine and his'n both. He's my father. So the idea is clear, right? The fierce pull of blood, his family, his dad is arguing against somebody in court. So he can't just think of the other person as his father's family enemy. He has to think of that person as our enemy, our family's enemy. And this thought gives him despair. He doesn't have any personal issues with the guy. It's only because of the family connection. And so we start to see the main problem of this story. His dad keeps getting into trouble, creating problems. And because they are a family, he himself is also forced to be involved. and he doesn't want to be. Back to the language. Ourn isn't a word, his'n isn't a word, but I think it's clear what they mean, right? Ours, his. So why is there an N at the end? Faulkner likes to write in dialect, 方言. If his characters talk a certain way, he will write out exactly what they say, the sound of what they say. So in this dialect, uh, ours is ourn, his is his'n, because of the word mine. It ends with N. And so this is called a hypercorrection, 过度修正. Based on this logic, in that dialect, the other similar pronouns are also ending with N. Should I say that in Chinese? No? OK，就是根据 mine 这个字的逻辑，它是用 n 结尾，所以在这个方言里面，其他的所有个代名词也是用 n 结尾。So this sentence here is actually very cleverly built to help you understand what these two words mean, right? You have the word mine in the middle to give you that clue. So the young boy could not see his father and his father's enemy, but he could hear them, the two of them, that is, because his father had said no word yet. Right. Three people, right? Justice, father, father's enemy. But he could only hear two people because his father had not talked yet. But what proof have you, Mr. Harris? I told you the hog, blah, blah, blah. So you can tell, right? The person asking for proof is the justice. And Mr. Harris is his father's enemy. And so Mr. Harris is now going to tell the justice what the young boy's father did. And then one final warning, this story, because it uses dialect, it records exactly what the characters say. It does use the N-word. Now, the polite thing to do is when you read it, you can read it. But when you talk about it, when you read the story out loud, usually we don't say the N-word. We just say N-word. So instead of, so this sentence I would read as, where is the N-word? Have you got him? That kind of thing. But if you read or write it, if you're quoting from the story, it's okay to write it. But if you're paraphrasing, it is not okay to write it. Especially in a culture that has strong racial language taboos like the US, these kinds of words are even worse than swear words. 就是在那种种族对立文化根深蒂固的文化，这种种族歧视言语会比脏话还严重。所以，像我上课有时候随便丢一两句脏话没事，可是读到这边，我绝对不会把这个字念出来。只有在写作的时候，如果要原文原封不动引用的时候才会写出来，甚至你自己写摘要的时候也会换别的字来摘要。Yeah, okay, so that's a story. It's like 10, 12, 15 pages long. So please read this before next class. Questions? Great. Please help me do my research and see you next week.